Hi. Some people, upon leaving the organization, people who have held on to their faith, wonder what God may want them to be doing. What service can they be of? Should they actively share their faith? Should they take up some charity work? We know of one exiting witness who decided to begin his Christian life by being a better mate, parent, neighbor, friend. And many doors of opportunity opened up just through that conviction and doing that. It was something that Dave and I wondered about after leaving the organization. One of the first things we decided we could do was to regularly give to the needy. And because I'm a people person, and I do enjoy conversation, I enjoyed it even as a witness, so I enjoyed field service. So I wanted to share what I knew. So I wondered how, though, I should go about doing this. Should I just talk to everyone I met? Should I systematically cover the neighborhood I was living in? Those were questions I had. What did happen was that we found we had more spiritual conversations more often than we ever did as Jehovah's Witnesses, even in our pioneer days, because we talked, not knocked. Conversation opportunities arose all the time, but more naturally, spontaneously. And by conversation I mean give and take, not just give. Listening is a big part of conversation. We had chats with people who frequented our bookshop, tradespeople who came in to fix things in the house. Sometimes the conversation was generated by them asking about our book collection. We had conversations with landlords, neighbors, people in the community, and most importantly, we had daily conversations at home, especially with our son Max. If you are a parent, your children are disciples, and the responsibility is with you to engage them in spiritual conversations. I fear many Jehovah's Witness children were neglected of personal nurturing from parents. This happens in the church as well, where people become reliant on others to do the instructing and not supplementing any kind of instruction from others with conversations at home. Parenting is a vital work for God. If you are doing that, you are doing for the Lord. I found some insights from a sermon that I read this past summer of Alexander Maclaren's book. This sermon was on Philip the evangelist. So I wanted to read you sections from it. This is about the life of Philip the evangelist. And the text is taken from Acts 21, verse 8, which reads, "We entered into the house of Philip the evangelist, which was one of the 7, and abode with him." This is what he says at the beginning. The recorded life of Philip is divided into two unequal parts, one full of conspicuous service and one passed in entire obscurity. So after talking about him being one of the 7 picked to serve food, it says after that happened, he fled from Jerusalem, like most of the disciples, after Stephen's martyrdom, and finding himself in Samaria, began to speak of his faith there. His brethren had set him to work at first. His evangelizing in Samaria had been laid on him by circumstances and Christian impulses, but his next step was in obedience to a specific command from Christ. He preached the gospel to the Ethiopian statesmen, and thereafter being carried by the Spirit to Ashdod, was again left to the guidance of his own judgment, and tramped all up the maritime plain till he reached Caesarea, where he settled down for 20 years, during which we hear nothing of him. But at last Paul and his companions, on their way to keep the feast at Jerusalem, found that they had a little time to spare at Caesarea, and took up their residence for many days in Philip's house. That is our last glimpse of him. He says, Philip's action in Samaria brings out very strongly the spontaneous impulse which constrains earnest Christians to speak for and of Christ. It was his brethren that picked out Philip and said, "Now go distribute alms." But his brethren had nothing to do with his next step. He was driven by circumstances out of Jerusalem, and he found himself in Samaria. Philip, without a commission, was the first to break through the restriction of the gospel to the Jews. Finding himself in Samaria, where Christ was needed, he did not wait for apostolic sanction, but followed the dictates of his own heart, a heart that was full of Christ and therefore must speak of him, and proclaimed the gospel in that city. So he has the noble distinction of being the very first Christian man who put a bold foot across the boundary of Judaism, and showed a light to the men that were in the darkness beyond. He did it as a simple private Christian, uncalled, uncommissioned, unordained by anybody. And he did it because he could not help it. He never thought to himself, "I am doing a daring new thing." It seemed the most natural thing in the world that he should speak of his Lord. It was because he had won his spurs in Samaria and proved the stuff he was made of that the angel of the Lord came and said to Philip, "Go down on the road to Gaza, which is desert. Never mind what you're going to do when you get there. Go." So he went with sealed orders. No doubt he thought to himself, "Strange that I should be taken from this prosperous work in Samaria and sent to a desert road, where there is not a single human being." But he went, and when he struck the point of junction of the road, from Samaria with that from Jerusalem, looked down to discover what he had been sent there for. Excuse me. The only thing in sight was one chariot, and he drew near to the chariot and heard the occupant reading aloud Isaiah's great prophecy. Philip knew at once that here was the object of his mission, and so joined himself to the chariot and set himself to his work. So Christ chooses his agents for further work from people who, out of their own spontaneous love of him, have done what lay at their hands. To him that hath shall be given. If we are ambitious of a wider sphere, let us be sure that we fill our narrow one. It will widen quite fast enough for our capacities. The reward for work is more work. He continues now. We have seen Philip in his brief period of brilliant service. We have now to think of him in his long years of obscure toil. That so faithful and competent a preacher should drop out of the narrative and be no more used in the impending transformation of the church from a Jewish sect to a worldwide community was the last thing to have been looked for, but so it was. He was left in Caesarea for 20 years while the great expansion was going on, of which his ministry both in Samaria and to the eunuch had been the beginning. In Philip we see the contented acceptance of a lot very much less conspicuous and brilliant than his beginnings had seemed to promise. Luke's designation of Philip in the latest mention of him as the evangelist. His former office of working with the alms is not spoken of, for it had long ceased, but he is still a preacher of the good tidings, as he had been in Samaria and to the eunuch 20 years before, and as he had apparently continued to be in all of unrecorded years between. His work was being done now in a very quiet way, and found no record, but it was done all the same. Time was when he had moved a whole city. Time was when he had a statesman of great authority to listen to his words. Time was when it seemed as if he might have been set to do the work that Paul was doing. But all these visions were shattered, and for 20 years he was left in his obscure corner. It matters little who knows or does not know our work. The great thing is that Christ knows it. Most of us have to be satisfied to render unnoticed service. The last incident in the record of Philip's life reminds us of the ultimate recognition of a good man's work and the joyful meeting of the workers. Paul and his companions have been hurrying to be in time for the feast, but he slackens his pace at Caesarea, partly because he found that he had some days to spare, and partly because he felt the atmosphere of Philip's house congenial. The older man did not envy the younger brother who had outrun him. He was content to accept the fate of pioneers, and rejoiced with all his heart to hear of what God had done by Paul, though once it seemed as if it were to be done by him. How they would talk, how much there would be to tell, how glad the old man would be at the younger man's success. And one of Paul's companions heard all the talk between the two, and his name was Luke. He doubtless gathered much of the material for the early chapters in Acts from the old man. So Philip was, after all, not working in obscurity, though he never knew that. The beloved physician who was sitting listening eagerly to all that he had to tell about the old days was to draw back the curtain behind which he was working and let all the world in all ages see him at his patient, unnoticed toil. When the curtain is rolled back from our lives, it will be well for us if we can show that what this man showed, namely, toil for Jesus, coming from a heart purged of envy and jealousy, and careless of notoriety. So I thought those were wonderful insights. Christians serve in many ways. They can serve by sharing their faith, but they can also serve by encouragement of other people, other believers, building up of the church. As pastors or teachers, parents, parenting children, raising them to be godly children is service. And prayer warriors, people who pray for the church. Take the opportunities as they come, and they will change from the seasons of your life as well. So take the opportunities that suit the season of your life and be grateful for that. There's always things you can do. I'm going to link to 2 of Ray Franz's videos from his book, In Search of Christian Freedom, about service, especially in relation to what we thought it was as witnesses. The first one is Law Nullifies Love, JW's Flock Neglected for Field Service. The second one is, are JWs good Samaritans or too busy to take the time from service?